Hey everyone, Ben Coomber Radio, episode number 459. I'm excited for today because this is a conversation that I see a lot at the moment online, and there's a lot of people fighting hard on kind of both sides of the fence. And my first encounter of this was, I think it was back like last year at SFN, maybe even the year before. So SFN is the Scottish Expo that I will be at this year. So if you're in Scotland or close to Scotland, come and say hello and listen to the talks that I'm doing. But anyway, I was on a panel and we were talking about nutrition and kind of diet and stuff. And one of the panelists said, well, you know, I just eat intuitively. I just sort of like eat what I fancy, and you know, I just kind of listen to my body, and if I want something, I just eat it. You know, I obviously try and eat quite healthy foods, and yeah, so my advice is just try and listen to your body and do that. And I sort of interjected at that point in the debate, and I said, you know, with respect, what if someone doesn't understand food? Like, you're a nutritionist, you really understand food, you understand what kind of is potentially healthy and not. You have quite a strong awareness of what the calorie intake is of a lot of foods. You spend time listening to your body. What if someone doesn't know all of that information? So calorie counting is then a way to sort of navigate understanding that. And we got into quite a heated argument, and it was actually really odd because I was sitting there thinking, how do you not appreciate the value of what calories can teach someone and what you kind of need as an individual? And then she couldn't really sort of identify with my perspective, saying that, you know, calories are stressful and they're causing people anxiety, and we need to just listen to our bodies and just try and eat good food. And it was really weird. And this individual actually has been such an anti-proponent of mine that she wouldn't even come to another event and talk with me because of it. And I don't think that's obviously a good thing, because I think we need open debate, we need open discourse to be able to speak about this kind of stuff and create some kind of middle ground and clarity. But that was kind of my first sort of intro with intuitive eating. And then it's come up quite a bit online, and I talked to a couple of recent podcast guests about it, and Tom, who's actually sitting there patiently while I waffle at the moment. Hello, Tom.
Hello, Ben. Nice to be invited.
Tom wrote a really good email to our education email list, the BTN Academy, and I was like, Tom, we need to write this into a blog. And then we wrote it into a blog, and we were like, right, we need to do a podcast on this, because I think it's a really big conversation. And then Tom's done a lot of research, and he's going to sort of navigate a journey through various different research and sort of thought processes of how we need to kind of attack this. So we don't have a really clear plan for this podcast, but we kind of know what we feel is the outcome and how we're going to get there. So we'll just see what happens. Tom, I should probably give you a little bit of microphone time, right?
Yeah, appreciate that, man. Cheers. Yeah, so intuitive eating, I think, is a really interesting topic because it's not a standalone topic. It's something that ties into an awful lot of other related principles, I suppose. And I think in order to actually talk about intuitive eating in an honest way, you need to talk about all of those principles. And I thought that was actually really interesting from what you said at the start about what the lady said to you on the panel. And she was like, well, I sort of eat whatever I fancy. You know, I try to generally pay attention and make sure that I eat good food, but blah, blah, blah. And that in and of itself illustrates that there is two branches to this, at least, if not more. So what do I mean by that? Well, there is a branch of the proponents of intuitive eating who completely reject what they refer to as diet culture, and I'll explain what that is in a bit. But for now, they completely reject diet culture, and that would mean that what that lady said, where she's generally trying to eat relatively healthy foods, but often she'll just eat whatever she wants, that is part of diet culture, or what people will define as diet culture. And so it just is a good way to highlight how complicated this topic is when you've got advocates for intuitive eating who won't agree with each other on what intuitive eating actually is in the first place. So any discussion that we're going to have today, I think that's a good way to preface it and say that look, if you listen to this podcast and you listen to this discussion and you think that we're completely arguing against something that you don't believe and that we're just setting up a straw man, would love to hear from you, because obviously that suggests that you're following principles of intuitive eating that we haven't come across or that aren't related to what we're talking about. But people do believe the stuff that I'm going to say today. I've got a bunch of quotes and things from people. So if that actually made sense, I hope it's sort of useful. But for today, the definition of intuitive eating that I work with and that I've found, I've got a couple of different resources for it. So there's a Dr. Lynn Rossi, who's a health psychologist for a system that promotes intuitive eating. She defines it as when individuals learn to eat, exercise, and experience their bodies from their own internal cues, such as hunger and fullness, rather than external cues, such as calorie counting and scale weights. I've got another definition here, which comes from Dr. Thomas, who received a PhD in nutritional sciences from Texas A&M University. She claims that intuitive eating follows principles like enjoying your food, eating when you're hungry, letting go of food rules, which would be to eat healthy food or not healthy food or whatever, not see foods as good as or bad, or not track meals and exercise through apps or fitness trackers. Now, I think that's a useful definition, because what it suggests is that actually they're principles that I think, Ben, you and I would agree with. They're things that we think that people should do. Like, people should enjoy their food, they should eat when they're hungry, and they should eat until satiation most of the time, or at least they should eat until they're not hungry anymore. You shouldn't have massive food rules. You shouldn't see foods as good or bad. And not everyone should track meals and exercise through apps or fitness trackers. And so what this tells us is that there's people who promote intuitive eating have oftentimes come up with different answers to the same problems that we promote solving. So we look at the fitness industry and we see that you've got people with the whole hashtag clean eating thing, and we've got people who promote basically orthorexia, and we promote ways of eating that go against that. But we don't think that intuitive eating is the right answer, and I think we can come up with reasons for that. But it looked like you wanted to say something there, so.
Mate, I always want to say something. So do you think this has really come about as initially an anti-movement? Because when I first grew up in the fitness industry, it was the huge focus on like paleo, whole food, like that was the driving like diet culture at the time and our understanding around nutrition. And then a load of people started to go, well, hang on, that's all great, but you've got to think about calories. And then the if it fits your macros movement became, absolutely huge. And then we've become sort of aware of mental health a lot more in the last couple of years because it's a problem. So all these talking points generally come about as a result of a problem. We start to see a widespread population issue, and we implement sort of strategies, blogs and teachings around it. So everyone's going around going, you must count calories, you've got to do this. And then people are like, well, that's causing a lot of people anxiety. So how about, we kind of screw diet culture and you don't have to count things, you don't have to weigh things, just listen to your body. And then there was a bit of a sort of body positive movement, and then those two sides kind of got drawn together. And Tom, do you think that's where it's originated from? It's almost started out to be kind of anti don't count calories, and then it's just become more extreme as more theories have attached itself onto it?
100%. I would say that the idea of intuitive eating, intuitive eating promotes itself as a backlash against what it defines as diet culture, which I am going to define in a minute. But the whole idea of diet culture, the idea that it's a thing, that stems from the healthy at any size and fat positivity movement. Because what diet culture is defined as is a thing that goes against the healthy at any size movement. So we've got here the definition of diet culture. Now, the thing is, diet culture is a very nebulous term. It's not exactly a scientific term, and so you'll find people that have different definitions. But this comes from Dr. Christy Harrison. I believe she's a doctor. If she's not, and she hears this podcast at any point, I apologize for wrongly promoting you. I know she's a registered dietitian, but she also has a podcast called Food Psych. Is it Food Psych? Yeah, Food Psych. So if you want to check out her work, you can. But she defines diet culture as a system of beliefs that worship thinness and equates it to health and moral virtue, which means you can spend your whole life thinking you're irreparably broken just because you don't like the impossibly thin ideal. It promotes weight loss as a means of attaining higher status, which means you feel compelled to spend a massive amount of time, energy, and money trying to shrink your body, even though the research is very clear that almost no one can sustain intentional weight loss for more than a few years. That's a point I'm going to come back to. Demonizes ways of eating while elevating others, which means you're forced to be hypervigilant about your eating, ashamed of making certain food choices, and distracted from your pleasure, your purpose, and your power. And it oppresses people who don't match up with its supposed picture of health. So that's the definition of diet culture. Now, you can look at that point by point, and you can see that obviously, if you are going to not take part in diet culture, you need to absolutely ignore the idea that being overweight is bad for your health. Like, you just can't pay attention to that. And that means that in order to not be part of diet culture, you have to accept the tenets of body positivity, fat positivity, as they refer to it. That's not me being nasty. That's a word that they're reclaiming. And so I think it's worth, before we even talk about intuitive eating, we need to talk about fat positivity and diet culture, because if you don't accept those two tenets, then you can't realistically practice intuitive eating, if that makes sense. Because in order to practice intuitive eating, you need to let go of the idea that weight loss is a good thing to aim for.
It's fascinating because all of these stories that we see online that are navigated by, people that are credible and uncredible, it's all come about from personal experience and the way that that person or individual has navigated their own health journey. And you see some really passionate people online, being staunch body positivity advocates and stuff. And you kind of look at it and go, okay, interesting. What's your background in this? And the background has quite often been, the opposite, and they've shifted the extreme way. And I think what we'll probably end up coming to at the end of this podcast is that every theory that we hold and every path that we follow has to lead us to the genuine outcome that we want. So if you're standing there saying, I'm fit, I'm healthy, and actually we start to look at some markers and start to challenge that, then we have to break down the theories and the things that you believe in, because they're not in alignment with actually the outcomes that we're tracking to kind of get you there. Where do you want to pick apart the whole diet culture thing? Because it seems ugly.
So the problem is there are some very good points there. I mean, obviously, if we look at here, something that worships thinness and equates it to health and moral virtue. The moral virtue thing's really important. I don't think anyone who listens to this podcast, I wouldn't imagine, but I certainly don't equate weight and moral virtue. I think it's two completely different things. I think in order to be someone who appreciates, or someone who believes that in order to get the most out of life, it is a good idea to maintain a healthy weight. Like, I don't think that means that you equate not being a healthy weight to being immoral. Like, I think that's something that doesn't need to be included in there. However, I do know that some people do promote that way. The whole idea of naming foods as clean and unclean, like, they're morally tainted words. Like, that's not a scientific way of looking at it. That's good and bad. That's a moral decision. And I do completely agree with people who go against diet culture that the whole idea of clean eating, that it's not good. Also worships thinness. I think it's useful to appreciate that people of varying different body shapes can be completely healthy. However, it just is the case. There's no getting away from it. It is the case that there is a given body weight which is unhealthy for every individual. And if you get there, that is going to decrease your quality of life to some degree. Now, I think that proponents of this idea would argue that actually the degree to which being what we're defining as an unhealthy weight decreases your quality of life is less than the degree to which diet culture decreases your quality of life. But I think that's a decision that they're making, and that's an assumption that they're making based on probably their own personal experience rather than anything else. There's a limited amount of research on this. Promote weight loss as a means of attaining higher status. Well, again, that's someone looking from the outside. We in the fitness industry don't talk about people who are lean and fit being of higher status than people who are not being lean and fit. But you have to admit that people like looking at people with six packs. People like looking at people who are fit. And I suppose you could say that from some limited perspectives, people who are lean in this culture do have a higher status on a social level than others. It's not the only determinant of your social status, but there's a lot of evidence out there that suggests that we look at obese people and we assume they have a lower IQ, and we look at lean people and we assume they're more intelligent. Up to a certain point where that probably goes away because we do have the whole bimbo thing. But yeah, basically what I'm saying is there's definitely truth to a lot of this. And so it's going to be very complicated because I don't want people who listen to this podcast who are into fitness and are into health and do believe that controlling calories to some degree is important, etc., etc. They do believe that the healthy at any size movement has gone too far, which is probably the way that most people would define it. I don't want those people to look at this and just throw out the idea of the negative impact of diet culture, because it definitely exists. But we've got a little quote here that I found on Dr. Christie. Again, I'm not sure if she's a doctor. I think she is, on her website, which I think says a lot. So she has a podcast, and in one of the descriptions of her podcast, she has a guy on called Dr. Hunger, which is his real name. It's an amazing name, but he's a weight stigma researcher. So his research focuses on the stigma that is pitched towards people of a high body weight and the impact that has on their general health. Health, obviously, remember, that's not just a physical thing. You've got psychological, sociological, cultural, spiritual health, etc. So she's written here, Dr. Hunger joins me to discuss how diet culture and weight stigma show up even in weight stigma research. And this is because one of the things that you'll find is that in the weight stigma research, researchers will say that weight stigma, so fat shaming, I suppose, is a bad thing because it's a barrier to weight loss. And anti-diet culture people will say that actually that's just weight stigma, because you shouldn't be trying to seek weight loss, because seeking weight loss is part of diet culture. And so we shouldn't worry about weight stigma impacting on people's ability to lose weight, because doing so is a circular argument. You should worry about weight stigma for its own sake. So he's going to discuss that, blah, 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 blah. But then his experience of diet culture within the gay male community and what intentional weight loss and the harmful practice of gay conversion therapy have in common. Basically, the argument of Dr. Hunger is that obese people are more or less born that way. And I'm going to go into that in a minute. And so trying to get people who are obese to lose weight is very similar to trying to get people who are gay to not be gay anymore, because they were born that way. And therefore, it's a bad thing to try and get people out of. And I found a quote from her, but I think I lost the tab. But the argument that Dr. Christie uses to back this up is that basically your health is not influenced by nutrition as much as the nutrition industry wants it to be. Your health is primarily determined by your genetics, your socio-cultural environment, and your experience or lack thereof of social oppression. And the problem that I have with that is that is stated as fact by individuals who follow this kind of idea. And obviously by comparing it to gay conversion therapy, Dr. Hunger obviously agrees with this as well. But here we've got a problem. And this is a problem that was outlined in like 1982 by Brickman and colleagues in a really, really interesting article in Scientific American, or was it? Let me pull this link up. I think it was Scientific American. But anyway, it was an article called Addiction and Personal Responsibility, a Fundamental Conflict. And what they did is they outlined the following problem. People who develop hypertension and heart disease because of obesity face difficulties. But you've got a problem there, because what this presents to us is an illness that is due to lifestyle choices, which are things that we have control over. A person who has obesity, therefore they've got hypertension and heart disease. That's a result of lifestyle choices over which they have control. But there are other points of these illnesses that have something to do with genetics, which is something you don't have control over. So I've talked about this before on the podcast. Someone who's obese hasn't chosen to be that way. The vast majority of people in the UK, according to NHS statistics, who are overweight know they're overweight and have tried to lose weight in the last year. That means that most obese people don't want to be obese anymore, which is part of diet culture. And what this tells us is that actually being obese is something that happens to people not because they want it to, and it's very difficult to get out of that position. And so we can't deny that there are things outside of that person's control that are leaving them in that situation. There's genetic factors that will make you eat more. Your enjoyment of exercise is largely determined by your genetics. Some people really, really don't like exercise. And we all have that feeling where you go through a really hard workout and you leave and you feel like you've achieved something, you get a big burst of endorphins, you feel really good. Some people literally don't get that. And so you have to ask yourself how likely you would be to exercise if you suffered during the exercise session and then afterwards you felt worse as opposed to better. So yeah, you've got your appetites genetically determined, but to an extent, the amount that you fidget during the day, so the amount of calories you burn, that's genetically determined. When you diet, how hungry you feel, that's genetically determined. So you've got all these things that people don't have control over. But at the same time, we do know, obviously, that the only way you gain weight is by eating more calories than you burn. And so some of it is under your control. So Brickman and colleagues in this article basically reveal that the two fundamental questions: who is responsible for creating a problem and who is responsible for solving it? And because you've got these two questions, that leaves you with four ways that people think about these kinds of problems, and these seem to be related to your personality. So this is not something where there is a true answer. This basically comes down to opinion, and there seem to be four different opinions that present themselves. So you've got the moral model. So people are responsible for creating and solving their own problems. That will tend to be people who are more conservative. The medical model. People are not responsible for creating or solving their own problems. Here we have anti-diet culture people. Here we have fat positivity people. People are not responsible for becoming overweight because there are all of these genetic factors and all of these socio-cultural factors that lead them to be obese. And they're not responsible for solving their own problems because it wasn't their problem to start in the first place. That's the medical model. It's called the medical model because the solution to that would then be medical assistance. You could perhaps you could give them dietary drugs or something. Then you've got the Enlightenment model. People are responsible for creating but not solving their own problems. So this is, okay, you became obese and you did that, but we in the medical community will fix it. Doesn't really apply to this problem. Not many people think like that. And then you've got the compensatory model. People are responsible for solving but not creating their own problems. That's where I sit, I think. I think that's where my bias largely takes me. I don't think that people who are obese are 100% responsible for that. I think, yes, we can argue that from one perspective they put the food in their mouth, but I think it's more complicated than that. But I think people on an individual level are responsible for solving that problem because literally no one else can. Mm. And I think the way that you answer those two questions and which model you sit in is going to determine what your views are on intuitive eating and healthy at any size, which are two, I'm using them in the same breath because I don't think you can actually separate them. I think if you are the type of person who views it as a person's responsibility to deal with their problem, then you won't agree with this because you'll start to think, well, actually, we don't need to demonize certain ways of eating and elevate others. You don't need to make people hypervigilant about eating. You don't need to make people ashamed of certain food choices. But our answer to that is not to say, well, in that case, diet culture is bad and people shouldn't diet and you should just accept that you're supposed to be obese because that's the shape of your body. You wouldn't complain about the size of your feet. You would just deal with the size of your feet and you'd buy different shoes. We wouldn't say that. We would say, well, rather than just continually buying bigger clothes and accepting the body is your body the way it is now, you'll do something about it. But I think there are an awful lot of people who are coming to the opposite conclusion, which is, well, all of these things, all of these parts of diet culture make people feel bad. And because it's not their fault and it's not their responsibility to fix it, we should dismantle diet culture because it's therefore a negative without any positives. I think it's just it's a cost-benefit analysis. That's all it is. And so when we've got people who think, like I do, and like I assume a lot of the listeners to this podcast do, where we think, well, yes, some aspects of diet culture will make people feel bad. Like, it's not nice that I've said on this podcast that I don't believe it's the right thing to do. I don't believe it's the right thing, but it is a thing that people who are leaner, who are in what we would define as good shape, generally have higher social status. You're more likely to get a job if you're attractive when you go to the interview. People tend to trust people who are attractive more than people who are unattractive, and there's a lot of data on that. I don't think that's right, and I don't think it's fair, but it is. And your response to that problem is either, okay, well, what can we do to help individuals improve their situation? In which case you would be a proponent of diet culture in this instance. And as a proponent of diet culture, you will struggle, as I do, to 100% agree with the tenets of intuitive eating, because to agree with the tenets of intuitive eating is to completely disregard diet culture. If in that situation you think, well, okay, that's not fair, that's a form of oppression, and therefore we should dismantle the system, well, in that case, you're going to agree with intuitive eating because you're going to want to dismantle diet culture because you don't think that it is a person's responsibility that they have become overweight. You don't think they should feel a responsibility to not be overweight anymore because, as it says here, the research is very clear that almost no one can sustain intentional weight loss for more than a few years. Well, that really depends on the method that's used. Like that's listed on these websites as a statement of fact, but actually people do sustain intentional weight loss for more than a few years. It's just rare, and that's a problem. Is the answer to that problem, well, stop trying to lose weight in the first place, or is it, well, work out what makes people successful and then work on that?
I didn't realise you were going to stop right there. I've been so enjoying listening, and so like at parts I've been like, oh yeah, and I think one of the fascinating things about the whole diet culture movement is like there's so many people that hate the way that diet culture has been constructed, and I agree with so much of that because so much of it is quite frankly fucked up. But when you start to question how humans behave and what is intuitively built within us, like standing there going, this isn't right, this isn't just, but when you explain that it is just is, like there's no real argument for that, there's no real counter. You can stand there and bang the drum and say we shouldn't behave like this, but if the human brain is naturally wired to behave like this, like how are you going to rewire that? If you walk into the room of 10 people, your eye will gravitate towards the person that is quite often more good looking or taller or looks stronger, because these people would generally have like looked after the tribe, would have been leaders in small communities. They probably would have been the more intelligent ones because they would have problem solved and, you know, built houses and bridges and shit. We still have that like primeval brain. And that's why we respond to those kind of people. So if you're standing there going, oh, well, we need to accept these people just as much as the next person. Well, if you track eye movement and behavior when someone walks into a room to multiple people, people will not behave in that way. Well, they will not behave equally. They will behave differently. There will be an order of hierarchy that is developed if those people are left in the room together to, you know, have a chat and see what's what and stuff. So that's kind of what I kind of wanted to interject strong at the most when you started to kind of navigate that, because I just you can't deconstruct that. Like that's human behavior.
No, I mean people will argue that that's cultural, so it's learned, and this is it goes back to blank slate theory as to whether do you believe that human beings have any form of pre-programming, or do you believe that everything that a human being is learned? And blank slate theory just doesn't work. I mean, so let's take the attractiveness thing, which is one of the hot button topics. There are an awful lot to this, but a lot of the people who are part of the fat acceptance, fat positivity movement, which is slightly different to healthy at any size for those. I do think that's probably an important detail to mention. There are slight differences there. But one of the core tenets of the fat positivity movement is that the fact that leaner people are more attractive or are considered more attractive is learned. That's a cultural thing. It's a cultural oppression of anti-fat people. And your fat bias is what leads you to have that belief. And so what we need to do as a society is we need to stop teaching people that belief, and then people who have larger bodies would be more accepted, but it's just not true. So there's a really, really famous paper by, I pulled it up here, Devendra Singh et al. It's from, I think, 2010. Yeah, 2010 in the Journal of Evolution and Human Behavior. It's called Cross-Cultural Consensus for Hip-Waist Ratio and Women's Attractiveness. So they basically took groups of people from Bikosiland, Cameroon, Africa, Komodo Island, Indonesia, Samoa, and New Zealand, and they showed them different pictures of women with different hip-to-waist ratios, and cross-culturally, they all agreed that a lower waist-to-hip ratio was more attractive. Now, that suggests, because it's cross-cultural, that it's evolved, it's learned. And we know why. It's because a female with a lower hip-to-waist ratio has a lower BMI, but it's not so low that it reduces the fat stores that are necessary for basically rearing children. There's an evolutionary benefit to doing that. Now, I'm not saying that that is the only role that women play, or anything silly like that. But from an evolutionary perspective, that's the way that human beings think. That's the way that we react to people. And the same goes, as you mentioned. You're more likely to be drawn to the attractive person, and yeah, it may be because they're looking after the tribe or something like that, but the simple fact is that human beings have evolved the ability to determine how healthy someone is. This is why, for example, if you eat foods that are really rich in vitamin A, you get like a slightly orange color to your skin. There's a word for it, but it's basically like a tan that you get from the vegetables, because the retinol gets stored in your cells, and it gives you a slight glow. And in research, that's considered to be more attractive than a suntan, even though it's basically the same color. And it's because it denotes health. It means that you're well nourished. It means that you're well fed. People who are underweight or overweight tend to be viewed as less attractive, and that's not a culturally learned thing. It's because we understand that that's not healthy. What's interesting as well, especially if you look at studies on men's attractiveness for women, so no, what men's views are of the attractiveness of women, it almost basically one-to-one lines up with fertility. So if you show men images of women, and the way they do this is really clever, because they're computer-generated images that don't have faces or anything, so it's not like specific individuals or anything like that. And you show them at different levels of BMI. Say you show someone with a BMI of like bang in the middle of the healthy range, they'll consider them to be X attractiveness. And as their BMI goes down from that, it sort of stays relatively even. And then around about the time when a woman would get amenorrhea, attractiveness absolutely drops off the scale. It's just like, no, that men in general don't find that attractive. And of course, I'm speaking on averages here. There's going to be individual variation in all of this. But then as BMI goes up, the decrease is far, far less rapid. And it's because fertility isn't affected as much as BMI increases as it is when it decreases, because amenorrhea is the thing that really nixes it. And when body fat is gained, that is affected less. So it seems to be down to that. But yeah, the general principle that I'm trying to get across here is that this is not necessarily learned. And so while we should, in my opinion, dismantle some part, like be part of dismantling some parts of diet culture, I don't think it's something that will ever go away, because I don't think it's a bad thing. Like, I don't think it's necessarily a negative for us to exist in a world that, for example, promotes the idea of a healthy weight. I do think that we should make a conscious effort, even though it potentially goes against some evolutionary drives, to give people who are of literally any body shape full respect. Like, I don't think you should respect a person less because they're obese. I don't think you should respect a person less because they're considered underweight. I don't think people like that should be ostracized in any way from society. I'm, for example, and this goes into the whole different genders and different roles thing. I think we should do away largely with interviews. I don't think they're useful. I think your performance in an interview has very little to do with your performance in a job role. And so we should remove that, because we know from like blind application studies that people who have ethnic sounding names tend to get jobs less often than people that don't have ethnic sounding names. People who have working class names tend to get jobs less than people who are called like Tarquin. And so I think we should do CVs that don't have names on, and I think interviews should be minimised as much as possible because it removes that unconscious bias, and unconscious bias is a thing. But, and there's a but, it's not black and white, and some of these things do have validity, and one of the things that does have validity is the idea that controlling your nutritional intake in some degree is a good thing, and maintaining a healthy weight is also a good thing.
I am almost speechless. I think I am. And I think it's just because, we started on a surface level of looking at intuitive eating versus calories, and then we dropped down a rabbit hole, and in this rabbit hole is evolutionary biology, is cultural constructs, like it's just mental. And previously on the podcast I've spoken about people like Jordan Peterson, and you listen to people like Jordan Peterson and they start to go in at a surface level of something like cultural diversity or whatever, and once you actually get into it and you start to deconstruct all the different elements, you realised how complicated a subject this is.
Yeah.
And about 10 minutes ago I kind of said a lot of this conversation is going to come round to where we're trying to get to, the tools that we're using to get there, and whether the beliefs are getting in the way of us using the right tools to get to the right outcome. So once we deconstruct all this stuff, someone has to have the awareness to be able to sit down with themselves and go, okay, I believe this, but is it serving me to get to the outcome? And, people online can sit there and go, oh, diet culture's awful, it's this, it's that. But if it's restricting you that much to implement a form of restriction that is going to get you to a goal, then when you consider your full perspective in your beliefs, you're no longer actually going to get to the place that you're happiest. Because the reality is, if someone needs to lose weight, there's going to need to be an element of restriction somewhere, somehow. And yes, that could be healthier, approached healthily, more so than is often done in diet culture. I'll let you jump back in again because I am a little bit lost, because I kind of feel like I want to go a bit deeper, but I kind of want to come back to the surface in my knowledge submarine so that people don't sit here and go, oh my God, what am I thinking and feeling right now?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that, again, I'm going back to Christy Harrison's website, and I'm not picking on her intentionally. She's just got a very well done website that makes things really easy to find. But one of the things that she's written here is diet culture doesn't just mean being on a diet, because you don't have to follow any sort of official diet to be caught up in the culture of dieting. And this is because people who promote diet culture believe that it's pervasive. It's something that's everywhere, which, if you define it as a recognition of the idea of a healthy weight, if you recognize diet culture as being something that counts calories, that views food as anything other than something to just eat and enjoy that provides energy, if you look at it as a source of protein, as a source of this or that vitamin or whatever, that is part of diet culture. So it is pervasive if that's how you define it. But she says, I've worked with hundreds of people who think they're not dieting, but when we dig into their relationship with food, they realize they're pursuing wellness or health in a way that looks very much like a diet. Now, that I think is quite telling, because that is then saying that basically any nutritional approach which you've engaged in specifically to improve your health or body composition in some way is a problem. And I would argue that that's very much down to the individual's response to that approach. I mean, I'm not on a diet, but I would be considered a part of diet culture because I eat in a way that is going to maintain my weight. I make sure that when I make my food choices that there's a protein source there. I will often say no to certain foods that I would enjoy eating because I know it's not appropriate for me to eat that because I've eaten a lot this week and I haven't really moved today and I've already eaten too many calories anyway. And that would mean that I would be part of diet culture. But that is a part of my aiming towards a physique and level of health that gives me joy. That means that I enjoy my life. And so I think that there's ways to frame that in a way that is less negative than the way it seems to be framed. I mean, you can frame anything in any way that you want to. And it's very easy, if you want to do so, to frame a conscious control of someone's diet as being negative, but that doesn't mean that it is. It just means that you're quite good at language. I think to bring it back to something that's a little bit more practical and more easy to talk about, though, I've got an article here from bbc.co.uk News from 6th of April 2019, and it's talking about intuitive eating. And it's got a bit of an interview from Tom Quinn, who's Director of External Affairs for the National Eating Disorder charity BEAT. And he is largely praising the principles of intuitive eating. And it's not just him, there's a few other people. But one quote that he says, I think, has got some pretty important things in it, even though they're not mentioned in it. So one of the things that Mr. Quinn says is that intuitive eating might not be the best first step for someone recovering from an eating disorder. So intuitive eating is often promoted as something that is going to help people avoid eating disorders or something that helps people recover from eating disorders. And according to a lot of testimonials, it is. People who have disordered forms of eating where they're overly restrictive, they count all their calories, they overexercise, etc., living in a way that lines up with what I've mentioned already as being intuitive eating, getting in tune with your hunger, eating food for enjoyment, not tracking stuff through apps. That's important. But as Mr. Quinn says, since eating disorders often distort people's hunger and satiety cues and place restrictions on what the person feels able to eat, intuitive eating can be difficult. For people in recovery from an eating disorder, meal plans are often used in treatment rather than reliance upon intuitive eating. Now, I'm not really wanting to go into the eating disorder topic here, but I thought that's very useful because of what he says about eating disorders often distort people's hunger and satiety cues and place restrictions on what the person feels able to eat. Now, he's saying that in a way that suggests that he believes that people who have a distorted hunger and satiety cue and who have a disordered way of eating shouldn't really intuitively eat straight away. Now, I would argue that you can't simultaneously hold that belief for people who have had eating disorders and become underweight, and yet still hold the belief that a person who is obese because of genetic and other factors that are external to them, and yet still believe that people who have eating disorders shouldn't eat intuitively, but overweight people should. I think that's not internally consistent. I think what that means is you're saying that, right, I understand that people who are underweight need meal plans or some sort of intentional strategy to gain weight to get to a healthy place. But I also think that people who are overweight for reasons that I don't think are their fault, largely down to increased appetite, socio-cultural factors that cause them to choose higher calorie, lower nutrient foods, are able to eat intuitively and not make their health worse. And I just don't think that's internally consistent. I think that's completely contradictory. I think it's basically special pleading. It's saying that if you agree with that if eating disorders distort people's hunger and satiety and place restrictions on what they feel able to eat, so intuitive eating is difficult and they should probably not do something else for a while, if you agree with that, I think you also have to agree that a person who is overweight, so therefore they will have distorted hunger and satiety cues, and rather than having extra restrictions on what they feel able to eat, they just don't have restrictions on what they feel able to eat and don't necessarily know what's a healthy meal, what's a healthy portion size, what's a good thing to choose. I think you have to agree that they potentially shouldn't eat intuitively straight away either.
Fascinating. And the reason why I think this topic is so important is there's a huge amount, especially in the female influencer space in the UK. I mean, obviously don't pay attention too much to what's happening abroad, but in the UK, there's been so many females that have grown up in the fitness industry trying to achieve what the fitness industry thinks that they should achieve or what they feel that they should achieve within the fitness industry. So be slim, be lean, be athletic looking. They've grown up and now they've become very staunch intuitive eating individuals because they've seen the positive effect on their lifestyle. But their message is coming into the ears of people that don't understand what they understand and the journey that they've been on. And then we've got this kind of like, I'm in a place where I'm not listening to my body enough. And now I'm listening to my body, but my current cues around food, both internally and externally, are eat for enjoyment. Like, eat this when you're out, and eat, a bit of cake if you want it. And without that process of education, that person's not able to stop and go, actually, is that the right thing for my body? Should I be making that kind of choice that regularly? And I just don't want that to influence people that are so early on in their nutrition journey that they're not really able to navigate how the foods that they're eating are related, to their body weight, to their health. Because, let's not beat around the bush. A lot of people are engaging in nutritional change because they want to alter their body weight. They want to change it. That's why most people go on a diet. So we need to have enough information, and the right information and awareness to say you are going to have to pay attention to volume of food at some point and type of food at some point, because you can eat a plate full of food and it be 500 calories, or a plate full of food and it be 1,500 calories, and that have a totally different impact on your long-term outcome. So yeah, I think this is a really, really fascinating debate. And actually, I think there will be a couple of people that will listen to this podcast and go, do you know what? You guys need to talk to X. And if someone wants to come on the show and we open up the debate a bit more, and, we start to really crack open the can of worms on this, then I'm absolutely up for this. Because there's lots of different perspectives and experience. There's going to be coaches that are listening to this that have dealt with loads of people in a certain situation or population. We're like, awesome, let's talk about that. Let's talk about how we navigate that journey, because it will be different to the journey that other people navigate. And I suppose coming back to one of the points that Tom made at the beginning, where you sort of fall into these two personalities or views around nutrition. And I'm in agreement with you, Tom, where, we might not have full understanding, awareness of how we got to the place that we're at, but we now have the ability to make the decision to take control, to be able to change the situation. So if I think about when I was 18 and I was obese, there was lots of factors that played into that. I didn't really understand food. I also understood and had beliefs around food that were incorrect due to my parental upbringing and my mum's incorrect belief patterns around food. I was then in an environment where food was fun and it was enjoyable because it was school. So people tried to eat pretty much as they can because it was a food availability thing. I was also a very active kid, so I'd spend like all afternoon doing sport, and then what happens? You get really hungry. So you probably go into the canteen and then overeat because you're just that hungry, and you haven't really learned how to respond to your hunger cues. Like in your, undeveloped brain, you're just like really hungry, eat what I can. That's a food that's tasty, so I'm going to eat it. And then, we see it all the time in adult populations. I have done a video online that kicked up a massive stink once where I said how endurance races can make you fat. And my point is that if you're not aware of what you go and do in your performance, so if you go and run a marathon and you don't have any awareness of a marathon's effect on your body, you'll finish the marathon and just be so hungry that you will eat everything in sight. And then tomorrow you're sore, you're tired, you're lethargic. You probably overeat again as a response from still feeling tired, but also your lack of movement because you're knackered and tired and you just want to sit down. So the education and awareness is so important here, and applying it to the right kind of context. But ultimately, the thing that I did when I was 18 is just decided to take control. And however much I felt was out of my control, I still wanted to control as much of that situation as possible to have a beneficial outcome.
Yeah, I mean, you can even view it as just a pragmatic thing. Like, we can say that, well, we live in an obesogenic environment. There are clear socioeconomic factors that will play into someone's likelihood of becoming obese. The price of food, the amount of time that you perceive that you've got to prepare food, because we can all say, oh, well, healthy food's really cheap. It's like, yeah, it is if you've got the time to cook it. But most people who are working minimum wage jobs don't, because they either rely on public transport or don't have a car. And most people who are on like the low income bracket, they work a lot of hours. They're very stressed people. There's a lot of data on the correlation between stress and income level, and there's also a lot of data on the correlation between stress and BMI. So we can say that there's all of these factors that play into someone's chances of becoming obese. But for pragmatic reasons, we have to agree that it's personal responsibility to deal with that, to get themselves out of that situation. It's not their personal responsibility that they're in it, but it is their responsibility to get them out, because that's the only way they're ever going to get out. The only other option is to be defeated, because let's face it, the socio-cultural situation, the economic situation, the et cetera, that's not going to change in the next 40 years. Like, the fact that there's a McDonald's on every corner and it's quite expensive to buy a bag of salad is not going to change in my lifetime, unless we have a nuclear holocaust, in which case all the problems are solved. So it needs to be personal responsibility. It just does. One thing you said there when you were looking at the fitness professionals who've gone through that education phase, and you think it's important to go through that education phase before you can start intuitive eating. I just want to sort of restate what I said right at the start in case it got lost. I think a lot of proponents of intuitive eating would agree with you there. Like, there are a lot of proponents of intuitive eating who are saying, look, intuitive eating is a really good way to maintain a healthy weight. Once or while you learn about how to eat in a way that's going to improve your body weight, your body composition, it's going to maximize your health. But I do just want to make it clear that there are the two camps of intuitive eaters. There are the people who think like that, and there are the people who just want to reject diet culture entirely. And delineating the two is a good idea, because if you don't delineate the two, you end up throwing the wrong people under the bus, or you legitimize a position that you don't necessarily agree with. If you're sat listening to this thinking, well, I promote intuitive eating, but I'm not about to tell somebody that they should dismantle diet culture and being obese is just the way they are, that's never going to change, don't worry about it. Because, yeah, they're two different positions, and I think they should be sort of separated. I do find it interesting, though, what you said when you were saying that a lot of the people that you've seen promoting intuitive eating do come from the fitness industry, where they've had a past of trying to strive for leanness, trying to strive for the six-pack and tracking every macro, and it basically became orthorexia, or which is a pathological desire to eat healthy food, for those who've never heard the term. It's like an unofficial eating disorder. It's not quite been added to the DSM yet. I think that's interesting because it ties into something that I think it was Dr. Mike Israetel said like 2 years ago that really sort of rung home for me. And I was like, yes, that's the thing that I've been thinking, but you've actually put it into words. You remember back in the day when, and I fell into this too, when If It Fits Your Macros was like first a thing. What you had is you had a whole bunch of people who'd restricted their diet to the point of just eating chicken, rice, and broccoli, or only clean foods, or you can't have whole eggs, and all of that bollocks that the fitness industry told you to do in like 2010. All of the people who'd been burned by that basically found this If It Fits Your Macros thing, and again I fell into this too, and they were like, oh my god, this is the best thing ever. Like, we shouldn't be restricting foods. Like, you don't need to restrict foods. But I just did it there. But we don't need to restrict foods was then tied up with we shouldn't restrict foods, and those are two very different claims. And what you eventually had is you had a whole bunch of people who were promoting this idea to overweight and obese people that they should be trying, not that they could, but that they should be fitting in a biscuit, they should fit in some chocolate, they should fit in some wine, they should do all of this thing, because if they don't, they're not enjoying life. And that's because that person hadn't enjoyed life because they'd over-restricted their diet for a while. But what they weren't taking into account is that actually, like, these people were ready for some restriction. Like, they'd been eating in an unrestricted way for like 30 years, and that's why they're obese now. And that little bit of restriction for a little while they're learning to make better food choices wasn't the end of the world. And this seems like a similar backlash. It's an overcorrection. It's people who've, rather than they've eaten a really clean diet, then they found you can fit a bowl of fucking whatever you want, a bowl of Oreos with chocolate milk poured over the top into your diet and hit your calories and still maintain health. And you're like, oh my God, this is brilliant. So I'll make all my clients do that. there seems to be a similar backlash where you've got these people who've fallen into diet culture. They've been obsessed with leanness. They've been obsessed with their BMI. They've been obsessed with being shredded all the time. They've actually realized that now that they've got a little bit of body fat on them and they're not nearly in the shape that they used to be, that they're happier. And they're now promoting that this is the way that everyone should live because it would make them happier too. And I think it's done with the best of intentions, but I don't think it's necessarily right.
Yeah, it's not often communicated in the right way, especially because of social media and how snippets of information are usually the only way we get things, and people quite often post online in sort of emotive states or where something has happened or they've experienced something, and it's all really heated, and it's like, oh, hang on, we'll stand back and think about the people that are actually listening to this message that you've just put out there. If it's not wrapped up, that kind of past and where you're at and the processes that you've gone through to get there, people are just going to be kind of left confused, and you just end up isolating and staying within this camp that just intensifies because you end up developing a bit of an echo chamber, and everyone's sort of torn in the same kind of message, and it just you all kind of spur each other on to just intensify the overcorrection that you want to see. And that's a great word, Tom. I haven't thought of it in that kind of phrase of like, we are overcorrecting the course, and people need to but the problem is that kind of doesn't sell. It's kind of politics. It's like, no, you're an idiot, we need to do this.
Yeah, I mean, exactly like politics as well. What you'll find is that when you're in the political space, the posts that create the most outrage are the one that gets the most clicks and likes. That's well known. But it seems to be in fitness at the minute, at least in the fitness pages that I've noticed. Fitness professionals, by and large, are quite compassionate people. Would you agree with that? Like, they're, especially in the nutrition space, maybe not in the PT space, but in the nutrition space, you tend to find it's people who, they want to help people. They want to help people get healthier and enjoy their food and enjoy their life. They tend to be quite compassionate people. And what you see is that anti-diet culture and pro-intuitive eating posts, they seem really compassionate. It's like, no, don't, and it's obviously, it's caricatured as well, because you're painting the diet culture in the most negative light possible. So it's like, diet culture mindset. Oh my God, I'm a terrible person because I've eaten everything. I need to go and run on the treadmill for 10 hours. I feel really guilty. Intuitive eating mindset. Well, never mind, I'll move on. And that post gets so many likes because it's so compassionate and it's so nice and it's what people want to hear, and it'll make them feel better. And the more people post stuff like that and get loads of likes on it, the more likely they are to post more stuff like that. The more likely other people are to see stuff like that and think, oh, that's a nice idea. I can start posting like that. And this is how a movement starts. Social media is a popularity contest rather than a is this a good idea contest. And that's not me saying that it's not a good idea, because it's not been tested all that much, and I'm sure with the right application. In fact, I would probably say that I bet with the right application, intuitive eating can be really beneficial for a lot of people. But you ain't going to get there with just the snippets of eat whatever you want, never feel guilty about it, pay attention to your hunger cues, just eat what. I mean, people have really bad hunger cues. Like, straight up, a lot of people have really bad appetite control.
Especially if you're underslept, which a lot of people are.
Yeah, underslept people have terrible appetite control. People who are stressed have terrible hunger cues. They have terrible appetite control. The minute people feel hunger, they think, oh my God, I'm going to die. And I mean, I've said this multiple times before. If you're going to lose weight, you'll be hungry sometimes. You don't want to be starving. I would never, ever advise someone to just starve or to be hungry all the time. But yeah, like, if you're not hungry about an hour before your meal, sometimes you're probably not in a calorie deficit. And so if you've got an overweight person and you're telling them that they should never be hungry, well, in the most compassionate way possible, you're making them afraid of doing something that's going to be necessary for them to do something that we know will improve their physical health. And the only way you can get around that is by denying that it's good for their physical health, I suppose.
Tom, this podcast has been fascinating, and it's making me think myself about just all the things that we see online and all the different journeys that people are trying to navigate. And I think a lot of the listeners are going to be sitting here at the moment going, yeah, like, fuck, how do I feel about all of this? And I think the only thing that I would like to see off the back of this podcast is to actually know, understand and hear what you think about this podcast. So I think this podcast is going to have a part 2. I think we maybe need to kind of drop into a few more topics in a different way and navigate it just like a little bit differently. So please do send in your comments to the show. Please send that to bencoomber@gmail.com with the subject line podcast. I'd appreciate it if you didn't do it, if you could avoid doing it on social media, just so I can piece the conversation together in one place, because otherwise it just gets a bit messy admin wise. If you know of a guest that is, a really strong voice in this arena and maybe wants to give a different perspective, then by all means invite them to the show, connect them to us, send them the link, send us the link to their profile on social media. We don't mind, but I think either way this conversation is going to want to be expanded a bit. And what I would do is, rather than reacting straight away off the back of this podcast as well, because I can imagine there's a couple of things that we've said today that have made you feel quite emotional about maybe some stuff that you used to believe in, maybe your personal experience with your diet and your body. Just sit on that for a little while. Like, don't react straight away and think, okay, this is what I believe in, this is what I've experienced, this is what Tom and Ben said, these are some of the counter arguments made. Like, how does that make me feel? Let's rationalize that. Let's not be emotional, because reacting with emotion doesn't help. Reacting with logic and reflection is the way that we get to truth. So just spend a little bit of time on that, and by all means send me an email, bencoomber@gmail.com with the subject line podcast.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, I just want to reiterate, other than things that I've quoted from people's websites or bits of research that I've cited, like, a lot of this is my opinion. I like to think that it's an opinion that I've gained from reading like the data, and it's opinion that I've gained from working with people and reading around how people work, how psychology works and whatnot. But it is just my opinion. I'm not saying I'm right on this. So if you've got an alternative view, like, it's not an argument to say that you disagree with me. It's just opening my mind to new views,
It's just another opinion, and one can be, valid for one and not for another, and that's just part of the course. So hopefully you've enjoyed the show. Please share us the love online. Tag someone in that you think can benefit from this conversation, and of course get involved in the conversation. Otherwise, I've got a great show for you lined up next week with someone that coins himself as a motivational speaker, and I wouldn't say we've ever had, quote, a person framed as that before on the show, and it's an excellent interview. I've already done it. I'm super pumped to share it with you. He's written a book called Raise Your Game, and it's all about kind of the mindset and the habits that would cause someone to elevate their own success. And it's not centered around a certain thing. It's just you looking at what you feel success is on an individual level and raising that. So that is next week's show. Otherwise, Tom, thank you so much for joining me and doing your research and being so eloquent today.
No worries. Thanks for having me on. I hope I was eloquent. I felt a bit rambly there, but we'll see.
If any of you want more of Tom's brain, then make sure you go to btn.academy. Tom is our head of research and head of education at the BTN Academy, our education company. So pop on over to there and listen to our musings. Otherwise, get involved in the show. Otherwise, I'll see you next week. All that left for me to say is go and have an awesome day. Goodbye.